Welcome to the Continuous Delivery Podcast. My name is Zarar.
I'm Cheesy.
I'm Phil.
Okay, so here we go with another episode. It's like third in like a month, I'd say, which is like a record for us, just pushing these out. Um, so let's start off today's topic with what else AI. But in this case, we're going to talk about kind of AI workflows and how developer workflows have changed over the last year or so, maybe more. And let me start with the question of like, if you're a developer who has been working on kind of like the thing we've been doing for like decades, it seems like, you have an epic, you break it down into stories, you execute the stories. And as you adopt AI first kind of workflows, and I'll start with Cheesy to give him the initial, and then Phil, you can respond, is that what is the worst thing you can do when you try to adopt AI and you have this mental model of like this task breakdown structure, epic features, but now you have this amazing tool at your disposal. What's the worst thing you can do when adopting AI?
I have two answers. Can I give them both,
Go
Gerard?
for it.
Okay. Well, the first one, and the thing that I see, the biggest mistake I see repeatedly is people don't take the time to learn their tools. They just download something, type a prompt in without doing any configuration or putting any guardrails on on it at all. No plugins, no nothing, and expect it to do something. And whenever they basically get the generic response, they're frustrated and they say AI doesn't work. So I think my first answer is, you have to take the time to learn the tools, and all of these tools provide the capability to tailor it to the task at hand. So that's the first answer. The second answer is a little bit different. What should you not do? You shouldn't give it huge tasks to do. You shouldn't say, go out and create this site, or, or even I was working with some developers where there was some really messy code. You said, go refactor all of this. And to be quite honest, really big steps like that will blow it out, and you probably won't get the desired result. So those would be my two ideas. Configure, know the tool, understand it, tailor it to your needs, and take small steps.
Mhm.
Phil.
Appreciate that. So, long-time listener, first-time caller here. Thanks, guys. So, I have a lot of opinions here. I think first they have to understand kind of what the developer is trying to do and sort of what context they're working in, right? I think the way that you'd use the tools in like a big team, enterprise level, is very different than the way that I would use them, like for a personal project, or the way you use them to learn something, right? So I think there's a challenge. Like everything seems good with AI, right? Like I call it sort of like the illusion of progress. Like if you put something in, it's designed to kind of make you think that you did something kind of effective. And I think that's super challenging to parse, especially if you don't, maybe you're not yet a domain expert, right? So I first ask myself, like, what am I trying to do here? Right. And then just to riff off of what Cheesy said, like understanding what the tools are doing, you can build a lot of code really fast. There's a term I heard recently I really like. It's called write-only code, right? So you can kind of like build your executable, and then it can be so complicated, you may never be able to update that thing again with features you want to add if you don't understand what the heck it is that you built, right? Or maybe the way I'd frame it is, are you building a solution or a dependency on an agentic workflow that you don't understand? It's a bit of like Conway's law there, right? Because the humans that are writing your code are these agents. If you don't understand it, they're dictating your architecture. How the heck do you know that thing is going to scale? That thing's going to do what you need to do down the road when your product needs to evolve, right? So there's quite a bit of stuff there, but I do think it's important to just take a step back and really think about what you're trying to do and experiment a bit, right? Am I doing it the right way? And learn from doing that process as well.
Yeah, I'll double click on the experimentation one because in this world, there are no experts right now, right? We're all sort of in this boat together. This technology kind of took our industry by storm about a year ago, really in earnest. And we're all trying to figure out like what the best way to work is. And I think trying different things, Cheesy had this whole like episode on Agile is dead. Uh,
Mhm.
and one of the things that I think what I talked about in that one was that I don't think it's dead because the need for experimentation is ever greater than before because AI is such a powerful tool and you can't necessarily align on this is the right approach for me because there are hundreds of different approaches on tackling a problem. Uh, so experimentation is still alive and well, and I think people who don't try different things will end up coming and they end up sticking with a workflow which they think is great, but really there's a lot left on the table. So experimentation, I think, is number one. And second, I would say is trying to map the hierarchical requirements model and try to replicate it in the world of AI. Because I have found, and I know this is a big violation of like Agile in general, I have found the batch size that I work in has gone up. My commit size has increased. My PR size has increased because I'm no longer necessarily working in that TDD style where you have these little small tasks. So I'm kind of breaking the small batches rule by working on maybe a feature at a time and committing like maybe 10 or 15 files that are related rather than working in the traditional TDD style. So that's a learning that I've seen. But if you ask like an agilista or like somebody who's like a Puritan in that area, they say, well, you're breaking Reinertson's sort of like small batch law. So I'd say experimentation and not trying to map your old mental model into your new AI driven mental model because you're gonna end up generating a lot of waste. Yeah,
Mhm.
cheesy.
Yeah, so we're kind of at a little bit at the opposite spectrum there in that I again work at a feature level, but one of the things that I do is I have AI break that down into a lot of small little things. Like I said earlier, when I was kicking off small steps, and I mean my workflow is that it commits and pushes the code every single small little task. And a small task for me is something that AI could finish in around 5 minutes or so. So that's like a small thing.
Mhm,
So in other words, a couple of hours worth of work for a developer, I guess.
mhm.
So I definitely find that working in those small steps, there's for me, there are some small little, or there are some huge advantages for taking those small steps. So uh, I won't go into the details of that because that'll take a while.
Yeah.
But I'll throw it over to Phil. Phil, you have something to add?
So maybe just a question, Cheesy. So
Mhm.
I believe you kind of get the results, right? So you kind of choose a task in 5 minutes, it outputs a result. I think when you have the right task, it's quite good at doing that. How do you decide what the right task is?
Great question. Well, should we get into our overall workflow?
Let's get into workflow.
Okay. So what I do is so it's different if I'm working solo or if I would be working with a team, but let me go solo first, okay? I decide what feature I want to add next, and then I will spend 5-10 minutes or so with Claude Code brainstorming that feature. I have some plugins for Claude that help me with that. So there's a lot of questions. Claude will work out multiple choices. So I'll spend a decent amount of time working out to try to make sure that I understand all the different nuances of that. Then I'll just ask Claude to write that out to a file. Usually I end up with a 10-15 page file or so. I'll do a real quick final review of that, and then once I feel good with that, I'll just tell Claude, yeah, okay, take that file, break it down into goals and tasks. You can think of a goal as something that maybe multiple tasks roll up to, and push it into Stride. And what happens then is that I'll end up with, 20, 15, 20, 25 or so small tasks, but each task has a huge amount of detail around it. Details around what files it needs to change, what's the test plan, how will it test it, how will it verify it, are there any security implications? A lot of details for each of those tasks. And then from that point, all I do is I just tell my agent, okay, just start claiming tasks, and it will work through that backlog and finish those and so forth. That's how I work.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question on that, Cheesy. So
Yeah.
I have something similar. Like you use Stride, and I'm trying that out right now. I use SpecKit and OpenSpec a lot.
hmm
So when you generate your task list based on the initial conversation,
hmm
like you get a task list of, let's say, 8 sections, 6 tasks each,
hmm
and it's plowing through it. Do you sort of like pause at each phase and review the code, or do some testing, or are you like, I define my task, go churn through these 8 sections?
So, I mean, with Stride, what you can do is you could tell it, whenever you finish this task, I want you to pause, and so it will literally stop at that point. Won't go until you tell it that you want it to go. But for the most part, I don't. For the most part, I just let it blast through them.
Yeah.
Okay. I have plugins that perform that tell it, the testing is very rigor. Because of strides, I have hooks that run at different stages of that workflow. So, for example, I have static, really harsh static code analysis. I have linting that happens, with each of those small tasks. I have security, vulnerability detect, checks and things like that that runs after each task. The tests run. I had to have a certain, amount of coverage, comprehensive tests, etc. So in other words, there are lots of checks from a quality code perspective, and there are lots of checks around tests along the way. So typically what I will do is I'll just let it blast through all of those. Okay. I don't look at the code. It commits it each time. It's up to me. I'll decide if I wanted to push the code after each one, because push to me takes it to production. Okay.
Yeah.
So if it's something that's a little bit trickier, I'll wait till all of them are done, and then I'll go out and I'll just manually kind of, eyeball it a little bit. And therein is where I start my prompts. So we talked about prompts. For me, prompts are just about making tiny little micro adjustments to something that I've already done. So I might go out, for example, and think, well, I want to tweak this UI a little bit. So I'll prompt it, hey, move that over there, that type of thing. And I usually use Tideway for that. So
Phil?
So I think, so I love your answer, by the way, Tuesday. I feel like I learned a lot there. And I honestly don't use agents as much probably as you guys do for my personal projects for various reasons. But what I'm hearing is like a lot of domain intention, right? So that part where you're experimenting with the model, kind of like chatting, sort of one-on-one, you're kind of like mapping out, sort of scoping out your work, a pretty good idea of like what feature you want in your mind. And I'm going to assume you're probably working with like a fairly mature, maybe not super mature product, but a code base that has some established, structure around it, right? So I love that workflow. What I found though is that when you're first starting out earlier on, I think it's less time in agents and more time kind of exploring, right? So even for me, I'd actually prefer just to write the prompts by hand. And part of it is staying in a flow state, right? So I don't know. The first time I spun up, I got a new computer recently. I installed VS Code. And I was excited to kind of just dive in and then try all the tools that I can't do in my lockdown kind of corporate environment. And I asked the agent to do something on like a small node code base. It was terrifying. Didn't just do one thing. It's just 5 more things. It was like modifying code, like going faster than I could read, in the chat window. And at the end of the day, I'm just trying to explore my domain, right? If I had let it do all 5 of those tasks, it would have diluted my thinking. I think it's like more code, I think is more dead if it's not structured as well. And I had to kind of pull back, make sure I had a solid base, a harness, and then I could kind of apply that workflow. So,
well, what did you do about it though, Phil?
well, honestly,
Because this
I
comes
took a
back to
different-
harnessing the tool.
so I took a different approach, to be honest. What I found, we can kind of get into this, but it's probably not as relevant for a developer and like a bigger team or sort of trying to kind of scale. But for me personally, it was more important to stay in flow states and kind of understand my domain than it was for the agents to do stuff, right? So what I found is keeping a super semantic code base, not actually using agents, but just kind of like uploading my code to a chat and like really carefully controlling the context myself and just kind of like having some of the intention in my code, right? So kind of stub methods or a lot of like mocks and memoization and just writing out the feature actually worked pretty well. And then instead of waiting 5 minutes, I get a response back in about 5 to 10 seconds. But a lot more of that was like thinking time, kind of like in my code versus with an agent. So for one person shop, if you will, like a one person sort of project, that worked pretty well. But I would equate that to if you're a solo developer, you know how your brain works. You don't really need design patterns. Design patterns is my brain, right? If you're in a larger team or like a larger code base, I think that's when this process, like it's not linear, right? It becomes much more complicated to produce something of value. I think that's where like spec-driven development agents are super, super important. But in a personal workflow, I think unless you apply the rigor that Cheesy does, I'd argue there's like a bit of a downside there that we may not be seeing, right? In terms of like over engineering, if you will.
Yeah, I mean the prompts thing is interesting because I do, one of the things that kind of tongue in cheek we talked about offline was that do we still need prompts, right? Do we still write long, all this like 4 paragraphs to give context to things? And answer is no, because I think the writing of prompts has now been outsourced to plugins and tools. Right? I think that's basically where it's headed. I think Cheesy, you mentioned you use a bunch of Claude code plugins to kind of explore the code base. And when you execute those plugins, behind the scenes, what those tools are doing, they already have written a thoughtful prompt on how to explore the code base. So when you say slash think or whatever your tool name is, behind the scenes, it's looking at your code, figuring out what the best prompt is, and then allowing you to explore. So to Phil's point, writing a prompt to me is actually breaking the flow state, right? Spending time on prompting, you are actually now not thinking about like your domain or your app or what you're trying or the problem you're trying to solve. You're back to doing mechanics and like monkey work. Right. So prompting to me, I know you meant it kind of like I still write prompts. To me, a prompt is now like a 1-line sentence or a 2-line sentence, not.
When I ask a question, and
yeah, go for it.
Just a quick one, guys. Like, should we use the word prompt or the word context?
They're very different things, right?
That's what I'm kind of getting at, but I feel like the latter is a lot more important. And I hear the word prompt all the time. Like, what matters is like how you get that context to the model. Different ways to do it, right? I think what like leading sort of spec-driven development flows are doing is they're recycling context, right? They're kind of like keeping some external state, they're orchestrating, and they're recycling context at the right time so that the model has like the right domain intention, and it's not going to go all over the place, right? A prompt doesn't imply that, right? So,
right. I mean, the history we have is prompts, though, right? Because I mean, you don't have to go back till last September, where the only thing that we had to try to curtail agents was an agents file, agent.md file, or something like that, right? And and so, but since then, Claude, Anthropic kind of led the way as adding the ability to enhance your agent. Everybody else is trying to catch up. Everybody has skills now, right? But it's foolish to think now that I could type 2 or 3 sentences and give all of the details to the agent that it needs to complete something. So what tends to happen then is you add a huge amount of variability, right? So you type 2 sentences, and then the other 90% of what it needs to complete the task, it has to figure it out on the fly. And it can figure some of it out from your plugins and things like that. But I personally prefer to have, all of the information through plugins, through the hooks, through the skills around what does quality mean and how do you do, what are some of the specifics around the framework or the language that you're working with. And then the requirements for the actual thing that you're implementing, all of that and the details being delivered to the agent just in time. And you're not going to do that by writing large prompts. That the prompts just don't accomplish that. Like I said, I do use prompts, but I use prompts after I've finished a feature to make some small, tiny little, maybe minor adjustments at the end. That's the only thing I use prompts for anymore.
I might so I'll give like a slight amendment, just the way that I think about this. So there's a lot of, if you think about it as context, your code is also the context. So what happens is prompt plus code equals output, right? And the output is probabilistic. So what I've been messing around with, and the results have been pretty good, is I don't even use Markdown anymore, to be honest. I don't use Markdown because I don't want anything to stand in the way of the LLM understanding my domain design that's in my codes, which doesn't include frameworks or abstractions that it can't see, which is, again, maybe not the enterprise or sort of depending on how you're developing. And with that, giving it 5 code files plus as little as possible, I find the results are like the less I give it in my prompt, the more likely it is to follow the style of my code, right? And I think there's a concept there around, it's kind of what I mean by context engineering, right? So kind of like precision, sort of like limiting the amount of tokens. I think there is a pretty well, it's starting to become well understood concept now where like the larger your context window, the more entropy, right? So like the less likely you are to kind of get that perfect response. It's kind of like earlier in the LLMs, like overall context size that you get better responses. And so I'm always trying to kind of like limit the context. If I see a chat go too long where I'm jumping around, topics, I'll create a new one, give it my code again. That's the base context, and see how do I describe that feature in as little, like as few words as possible, while still giving it some intention. It's worked pretty well for me. I know that's a bit unorthodox though.
I think you're also going into the. I think it's prompt versus context, but also I think it's also memory has something to do with it here as well, like long-term memory. Because once your context, yeah, I actually agree. Like some of these like big like 1 million context windows that are being released now, I'm not actually excited by those things for some reason. At least for my personal workflow, I'm like, yeah, I'm sure like the bigger it is, the more it'll mess up, right? And I think that's why going back to tooling and workflows is that the way you solve the problem of like polluting context is not by necessarily not putting enough in the context, but having the tool pick up the right context on its own when it needs to. And that's not an easy problem to solve,
No.
but I think it's currently being solved fairly well by skills.
Except skills aren't loaded in the context, which is
They're
another
not loaded in the context.
benefit.
Well, their front matter is, but
Mhm, mhm.
but they're not loaded into context.
That's right.
But your agent is smart. So, for example, if you say, I want to develop this UI component, and you have a skill called how to make UI component, that's its trigger of reading it and then doing whatever it needs to do. So it really goes back to the first point we mentioned is that, well, context management. But also one more thing is I think Cheesy mentioned his product Stride a little bit. There's also Beads out there by Yegi.
Mhm.
These are things that once you make big plans of writing a lot of, like you make a whatever 15 page plan, you don't go and execute it directly into the agent, because if you do it like that, you're chewing up your context window.
Mhm.
Everything's going into context window, and then what Phil's saying is kicking in. Things are getting confused. It's too big. Now you're messing up. What you do is you take that and you put it into some sort of a task management tool. Cheesy has Stride, Yagi has Beads. I'm sure there are like a couple of other ones there as well. Now you work with your agent off of your task management tool. Then you can actually like close your computer, go back, have dinner, come back tomorrow if you want, and the task will remember where you left off. Like to me, that's like the next sort of like next level workflow after spec-driven. Like spec-driven, the output of spec-driven development is the input to the task management tool.
And the beauty is that you don't have to be there to feed all of these prompts. A perfect example is yesterday morning, I needed to add like export to an Excel file to a software I was working on, right? And so I'd already worked, I brainstormed it, all the tasks were there. I kicked it off and I went and took a shower. Got out of the shower, came in, made a coffee, drank my coffee for a while, went back, and it was done. And there were a lot of tasks there, I think, well, not a lot. I think it was maybe a dozen or so tasks, but it only had to get the context for each one at a time. Okay. And all of the information and all of the details that it needed to complete that was delivered as part of that request. So yeah.
Okay, so we're going to do a series on this podcast where we're going to look at developer workflows, and we'll start
And
off with
tools and
DeepSeek and then
configuration.
mine, and then we'll hopefully learn something from there.
Mhm.
But let's switch topics for a second. Over the last couple of weeks, I think we've all been raving about Opus coming out in like late last year, and that kind of changing the game big time.
Mhm.
But there have been other. Z.ai came out with a model yesterday, which is performing on the benchmark extremely well. Kimi K2, which is the Chinese model, is beating Claude in some benchmarks. And I know benchmarks aren't everything.
Mhm.
So you have these sort of these like open source models catching up to these billion-dollar valuation companies.
Mhm.
So, Phil, I'll let you go first on this. Do you short Anthropic stock if you had it? 10-year plan.
Oh
You short
man.
it.
So not a chance. Do you want me to go literal or philosophical, by the way? I can go either way.
Yeah,
So
we'll go take it wherever you want.
philosophical. Which one do you want?
Yeah.
Philosophical? Is that what I'm
Go wherever you want, man. Yeah.
Okay, so I have one thing I think is important is like, I think there's a Linux analogy here. Like, it's really important that we work with the base technology. Like, when you say Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, it's not just one model. Like, whatever they're doing in the background is like a very complex probabilistic system around the model to get what it thinks you mean the best responses. So you're not really doing like direct engineering with the LLM or some direct development, whatever you want to call that, right? So that's what I kind of meant by like building a dependency. If it's too easy, it's probably because Claude or OpenAI or Google have some magic in the background to kind of like infer what you mean that you're not seeing. And so just be careful, right? Because that's their product, not yours. When you work with an open source model, like one that just like the raw model with, you can kind of directly interact with its settings, temperature, sort of whatever. Now you can start to do that experimentation yourself. And I think that's super important, right? Like, think about like how you do development probabilistically. You should probably run the same prompt 100 times. See what happens, right? Like what type of reason are you invoking? Is there like a large variance in the responses? Is there not? Like, that's how these big companies are developing these products, but very few people have the infrastructure to do that. So that to me is honestly a little bit scary. It's very much the antithesis of like how the current digital world was developed in the foundation of open source software, Linux, kind of et cetera, et cetera. These are very big closed systems. So just philosophically, quickly, I would not short the stock. So I think if any of my assessment is based on kind of like my first year economics knowledge, I'm probably not going to use that to kind of guide how I handle those investments, right? So I think some things are too obvious, right? Like, obviously the current products, they don't make economic sense. I think what's happening is more of like a utility play, right? So we cannot tell what the future products are going to be like. My philosophical statement is, so attention is money in this world, right? You kind of like give a request, you get a response, right? To some like digital, thing. I think in the future, a huge percentage of web traffic that is served by traditional servers now will be served by LLMs. And so what does that mean? And it's not going to be chat. Like, unless you think humans will be chatting, 16 hours a day instead of like browsing and kind of doing whatever. And I think that's where I think people need to be maybe not careful, but like, if you want to learn and sort of position yourself, I think, to be at the precipice of how much money is being invested in the space, finding a way to sort of like learn how to be productive with a probabilistic system may be more valuable than kind of like getting a result, from a prompt or from a product that's being released today by some of these billion-dollar companies.
Cheesy, are you shorting Anthropic? Because I am.
I am not. I'm not at all. So, and you mentioned Kimi
K2, yeah.
Yeah, no, 2.5. 2.5 is, and I spent some time with it not long ago, actually. So I've been going through and writing some enhanced instructions around 9 different agents, LLMs, and what I found was that Kimi was the one that was in last place as far as being able to provide more enhanced instructions. In fact, the only thing it supports, at least that I was able to find, there might be some hidden deep dark configuration that I don't know about, but the only thing that it supports right now is just the basic agents file. So, and the reason I won't short Anthropic is because, I go back to last, June, July, that time frame where Anthropic, that's all you had as well, was like an agents file, right? But Anthropic has made lots of changes around that. And guess what every other LLM is doing right now, except Kimmy, is they're copying what Anthropic did. And in fact, pretty much every LLM out there came up with announcements in December and January. Hey, we support skills now. And 2/3 of them actually, if you have Claude skills installed in the .claude directory, guess what? They read it right there. So, I mean, GitHub Copilot, guess what? You put your skills in the Claude directory, they read it. Cursor, the same thing. And I can go right down the line, open code. And so I think Anthropic is still leading. If you look at the changes that came with 4.6 version of Opus, if you've used it for any hardcore development, you can be blown away by the automatic parallelism that it does right now. Now I for the last several days I've just been shocked by how much faster things are, because right now it's spawning up 5 or 6 different agents on its own. And parsing to work out, oh, we need to do a little bit of design. Let me spawn a design agent to do this. Or I had to add 7 translations to a page that I was working on, and it spawned an agent for each of them and just sent them off to do it while it was working on something else.
Yeah.
And that is what, Anthropic is leading in a lot of that thought process.
Yes. Phil?
So I think I want Cheesy's context window, because I have no idea how you go so deep in all this stuff, by the way. I'm more of like an emotional, sort of experiential kind of, let me give you a more direct answer to the should we short the stock. Like, is the value in the chats or like the product that we see right now, or is the value in the fact that they have hundreds of millions of people interacting with this and they have all the data and they'll be the first to market with the next set of products?
Yeah, I don't care either way. What I care about,
Stock market.
I'm
That's
seriously
why I'm not quoting stock, by
about
the way.
being able to get things done in a rapid time frame and maintain very high quality tested code. And right now,
100%.
I've worked with numerous, agents or LLMs out there, and in my opinion, Claude Code is still the best.
Okay,
I
so
like Gemini.
let me. Okay, I have 2 points. I think. One, I think I want to separate the model from the coding agent. So I think you can use Claude Code with different models now.
Yep. Yes, you
Right?
can.
So I think in terms of like model power, I think those are converging and will continue to converge. And that's not me having some sort of an insight. That's just me looking at the last 2 years on how the open source models are actually getting closer, and not there yet, but getting closer and closer. I would imagine they're eventually going to converge. So if the models are more or less the same, and we haven't even talked about Qwen Coder. I don't know if you've tried that.
I haven't.
Yeah,
No.
a fairly productive model. But now you have the actual coding agent, which is integrated with those LLMs. I think the value, I think maybe that's Phil's point, I think kind of is that, is that we have all this data we're giving Claude, and they're building amazing coding agents with it, which can utilize any LLM. I think their major product in like 5 years or 2 years may not be the model itself, but the framework around it, which is Claude Code right now, which is killing everything, right? And Codex is trying. Microsoft's trying with Codex, but I haven't had great success with it. Phil?
Thank you for translating my gibberish, Sarar. So it's exactly what I meant, right? It's like if I want to build a probabilistic product, crap load of data interactions, right? It's very different from building a deterministic, like a product with a deterministic system, right? So the fact that they have all that data, like I think the product will be like higher order reasoning. Like code is just the easiest thing to access. Anyway, I'm not going to get too philosophical with that, but I do think there's something there around how the heck do you harness like a system that works on probability. The answer is like sampling it a ton of times. We're kind of doing that for them.
Yeah. I have one more topic. I have a second point that I was going to make related to this one, which was I think this is more me being hopeful than anything. Is that you remember back in like 2002, 2004 when like the IBM mainframe was king, and like they used to get away with like billing people on the MIPS. Like if the MIP crossed this threshold, even like for 2 seconds a month, you paid as if the entire month you spent at that MIP level, which is how they made their money. And then what happened, right? People started. I remember the Walmart guy did this presentation on how Walmart was like developing web apps, and the guy had like 60 Tomcat servers running on like P3s and servicing their entire customer base. So the commoditization of like hardware was there to see for everybody, and then obviously things went down.
Mm-hmm.
Moore's law, I think this is called maybe. I see, and I don't know if this is going to happen, but I think what I hope will happen is that over time we're going to see some sort of a commoditization of both the model, which is already happening, I think, but also maybe the hardware at some point. And that innovation has yet to happen. But I think as soon as we sort of like break this like constraint of GPUs, which I think we will at some point, it's not going to be me. It's going to be some dude somewhere, some girl, guy somewhere will do it. I think that's going to be the inflection point where things will now, what Phil said about like, oh yeah, well, every time you go to a website, an LLM will serve you, right? For that reality to manifest itself, I think the hardware costs have to go down dramatically. I don't see that happening without hardware costs going down.
Yeah.
Great, I'm right. Okay.
No, what I'm going to say is like I'm actually very tempted to build like a home sort of server with models now. So I just feel like to me the value is experimenting more, and I don't like layers between me and the system that is potentially going to do what your sayings are or like whatever else in the future to kind of. A lot of people are making really big bets, and there's probably something behind that, like whether we can see it or not, whether they can see it or not. And the fact that we can't experiment easily, that's what kind of concerns me. And when I say experiment, I mean with probability. I want to hit that thing 1,000 times, see what it responds, change a few words, right? Kind of write my code differently, see if that code style is more effective with the model. That type of experimentation, because of the cost of hardware right now, is like really hard to do. You're not going to drop 20 grand into a rig just to run like a decent sized model to do it. But it's unfortunate. That's not really how like the internet was built.
Jeezy, you want to add anything? Or because I have one last topic here.
Bring your last topic.
Okay. So now that boilerplate is dead, right? Boilerplate is gone, right? It's the cost of writing boilerplate is down to 0. Does this impact how we architect our systems anymore? Like, does it matter? Like the classic sort of N-tier architecture that pretty much every web app has. We've always sort of said, oh, well, your adapter layer is different than your business layer. Your business layer is different than your controller layer. Your view layer is different. We have all these like segregations in our architecture, and each of those steps has a lot of boilerplate associated with it. Now that now that Cheesy doesn't even look at his code anymore, now that maintainability has been outsourced to AIs, now we don't actually go in there and go, oh wait, let me just go into my business layer and make this little change. You know what I mean? We just let the AI do it. Does it change how we have traditionally architected our systems? How has it impacted that aspect?
That's interesting because what I find is that whenever you're working inside of pick framework ABC, pick framework like Angular, like Spring Boot, whatever, those the corporate frameworks out there, AI is very good at leveraging those frameworks. AI understands those frameworks probably better than 95% of the developers you have on staff right now. And it will produce code that follows it will learn your code over time, okay? And if you provided your own skills, it will use your standards. If not, it's going to bring from the internet probably the best practices around building a Spring Boot service as an example. So, and yeah, it will kind of produce layers in that perspective because that's sort of how Spring Boot works. Okay. But not, it's going to build those architectural layers because that's the framework that you're using. Likewise, for example, Zarar, you and I use a lot of Elixir, Phoenix Live View type stuff, right? And it puts the layers in there as well. It knows, where does the ecto code go? Where does the live view reside? And so it's kind of
Let me give you a concrete question. This is
yeah,
a real question I had like an hour ago. Okay.
okay. Why didn't you
So
call me an hour ago?
I did wrote a, let's go with Elixir, wrote a feature in Elixir Live View, right?
Mhm.
And in Live View, it did what it needed to do. And it also included a repo call, like a database call, something that belongs in the context. It added to the Live View,
Wow. Okay.
right? But it worked, totally worked,
Yeah.
completely worked.
Mhm,
And now, if you're not even looking at the code, as you said you don't,
mhm, mhm.
is that okay? Like it's working. I mean, I'm not ever going to be modifying the live view and like getting confused that there's a repo call there. Like I'm not going to ever take that layer out and like shard it on something else. I don't need it separated, right?
Mhm.
So
Wow.
why should I care?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, I know that I have a lot of skills, plugins, and subagents that know a heck of a lot about Elixir, Phoenix, Live View, Ecto, all of these
No, no,
things.
I get it, but answer the question.
So
Like, why should I care?
I don't look at my code because I know after looking at it, 700 times that it's doing the right thing, right? And
Okay,
so,
okay.
yeah, why should you care? Maybe you shouldn't. Okay, maybe you shouldn't. But that what you just said was probably not a great thing either. Uh, there's nothing wrong and there's no security vulnerability or anything like that associated with that. Basically, well, all it is that you miss an opportunity to push something down into a lower level so that it's more reusable, right? And in a lower level that already has, the database connection there. So that's all. Uh I don't know. I
It's a tough one. It's a tough
it
one.
is. It
Yeah.
really is. Yes.
Phil,
Can
go
I
ahead.
ask an easier question? And then I want to talk about JavaScript, by the way. So first
Yeah.
the question, then we're going to go to JavaScript.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to kind of think of your workflow and sort of equate it to mine. One thing I found is once I interact with LLMs enough, you kind of have a rough mental idea of like the complexity of tasks you're giving it, like how long it should take, kind of what the steps the agent should spit out.
Mhm.
And I would devil's advocate cheesy. I think you probably do look at that, right? Like if something you expect to do takes like 3 minutes, or you expect to take 3 minutes, it takes 30 because the thing's in some kind of like logic loop for whatever reason. Maybe there's like a bug in one of your specs that you fed it. Well, you'd probably look at that, right? It's like is that a leading indicator for you?
If something takes a long time, I absolutely will go out and say what happened there. Okay, but it's I'm trying to think of when was the last time that happened. Maybe November, December, something like that. I don't know. It.
Exactly. It's
But yeah, if something took a long time, so I have okay. I've had one case since I upgraded to 4.6 of Opus where Claude hung. Why did it hung? It was waiting for one of the sub-agents that it spawned to respond, okay, and it didn't respond, but Claude was sitting there. Well, or maybe it did respond and Claude didn't get it. I don't know what it was, but I it sat there for a while when nothing happened, and so I killed it, and I said, "What the hell is going on? Keep going." And it picked up, and then it kept going, and so I didn't look at the code at that point, but
Were you using Tidewave?
I was not. I was using Claude.
Oh,
I
okay, because in
actually, I
Tidewave,
wasn't
I
using
get
Claude
Claude
directly.
hang up and I just go you there and then it starts up again.
I wasn't using Claude. I was using the Claude uh, add-on for Windsurf at that time. I was using Claude inside of Windsurf.
I would say as an experiment, cheesy, and like I could be totally wrong, but I'd love to see. You have so much experience with this that I think a goal for anyone listening could be get to the point where you're able to break down your features the way cheesy does, where you're so confident that you don't look at it and it takes 3 to 5 minutes and like you're good. Your sort of mental linter just kind of works. But I would actually like try to do it in one shot next time and see if it works. Get rid of the agents, just hit Opus 4.6 or Gemini 3 Pro. So give it the same context, like give it the same like files, right? So I usually upload my entire code base, like stripped of config and like whatever else is going to confuse it, and write what you're going to do and see if it works. Because what I found is doing that, it takes 10 seconds and there's no waiting.
What do you mean upload your entire code base?
So like I honestly, I'm not going to share my screen, but like think about the context window. Like what I do, honestly, I was doing this on vacation. I was sitting there with a new laptop. I only had VS Code and like whatever, Gemini. I was very happy, just in a flow state. Didn't want any sort of noise kind of around me. And I wrote a tool in my JavaScript code base, which I do want to get back to, by the way, called Strip Code for LLM. And what it does is go through and it strips out like all the crap that's going to confuse the LLM, right? So I get rid of obviously like the node modules and stuff that I can't upload, but there's a whole bunch of stuff like prettier config. There's like probably images, like there's 20 to 30 files in my code base that are not semantic describing my domain. So I strip that out, I give the model the whole code base. It's all like as semantic JavaScript as I could write. So all the function names kind of mean something. It's also functional. Everything's mocked. And then I write 4 lines and it does a whole feature for me. So it's kind of what the agents are doing, if you think about it. Now, I'm going to go back to your question for a second, Zarar. Architecture. There's a bit of a logical kind of path we can follow here, right? So if LLMs are the future of writing code, right? So if we're going to do less manual code, we're going to sort of harness these tools, kind of like direct these tools to write code. Our architecture should be whatever enables them to work the best. And I think this is kind of like what we're missing a bit here. Not the three of us, but I think just kind of like the industry, like we're chasing kind of like this next shiny thing that may not even be the shiny thing, depending on kind of where you think the stock's going to go. But anyway, won't get back to that. But it's around how do I architect my application so the LLM can kind of do this. And for me, it was literally, I actually have a contributing file that has all these rules in it. You can take a look at, but it was like no libraries. I only have like Express or like the ones like Spring Boot, whatever. Like I know the models know, so that's fine. Everything's semantic JavaScript. The way I structure my files is different. I don't want mixed domain context in files, right? So there's just like stuff that you wouldn't do, maybe if it was for a human, that you would do for a model. And the code is your context. The prompt is like a tiny amount of context compared to the code. So it's kind of, to me, it's like prompt engineering versus context engineering. Like the latter is really, really what matters in this world of like models that can do so much more higher order thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a topic maybe to get into some other time on how to write code which is easier for LLMs, because we're talking a lot about how to write prompts and files and all these things which are easier for LLMs, but we haven't really talked about. We've always treated code as sort of the output, not necessarily, like how do you write code which the LLMs understand better, as you said. So maybe that's a future topic. But our time today has come to an end. Thanks, Phil, for joining the pod.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, guys.
Listener, see you again soon enough. No promises, but it's been looking good lately.